Fate Stay Night is not an H game. As the popularity of anime continues to widen, its newer or more casual fans often never find themselves minding the frontier around anime. The light novels, the web novels, manga, or visual novels that those of more hardcore otaku milieu might be further acquainted with. This creates a discord and discussion when people begin encountering those frontier works for the first time. And if they are visual novels, they will be encountering some of the most niche the otaku culture has to offer. Perhaps it is by this phenomenon then, that when the Fate series began to be more popular, and more attention drawn to the originator, Fate Stay Night, that the idea began floating around that Fate Stay Night, the visual novel, is a hentai. Fate Stay Night is not a hentai. I can't fault someone for making the mistake. Visual novels as a medium are drenched in a tradition of eroticism, hailing all the way from its inception, even as a concept in the 90s. Following the popularity of Chunsoft's first The Portopia Serial Murder Case, a mystery game of exceptional fame and importance in Japanese gaming history and culture, a number of titles centered around the idea of a first-person narrative-driven storytelling of horror emerged as what were then called sound novels. Coming out of the popularity of murder mystery novels of the 80s and 90s Japan, sprouted a game that would drive this new artistic direction of narrative-driven multimedia software and become the standard that everyone would replicate. Released on 1996 on 5 floppy disks, its name was Shizuku, and it was by the company Leaf. The first change was the transition from horror and mystery to romantic comedy, taking inspiration from dating sim games but conforming to a new narrative-driven direction. It also undid the orthodox framework of avoiding horror bad ends to pursuing romantic good ends, while also moving text from the center of the screen to the bottom, so as to not cover the art. On the subject of its art, it also had one more characteristic that made it special. Progress far enough into some heroines' story routes, and one may encounter scenes with erotic content. A treasury of romance stories and romance readers had followed its success in 1997, the following year when To Heart, among others, were released. They mimicked Leaf's Shizuku, including its inclusion of erotic characteristics in some cases of the story. Leaf, now the forerunning visionary of a budding romance genre, in an equally underdeveloped, impressionable, and malleable new field of visual novels, released a smash hit in the following year of 1998 with their visual novel White Album, continuing the tradition of ambitious literature written independently of mainstream literary trends, coupled with an unashamed delivery in writing and a nonchalant inclusion of erotic elements in storytelling. One of the first issues I take with the mistake of mislabeling an H-game is it shows a misunderstanding of the visual novel culture as a whole. There is an equation I've seen online of visual novels to just porn games or shitty Newgrounds games, when visual novels like Steins Gate, Fate Stay Night, Ever 17, Chaos at Noah, Little Busters, Danganronpa, Love Love Alternative are all famous titles with rich stories and critically acclaimed writing, and of those 7, 3 of them are eroge. It is a callous and immature prejudice to write off any of these classics just because of the genre of titles that surround them. Why most visual novel fans are able to differentiate between these may be due to deep exposure of these classics, such as Canon or White Album, which had a remake over a decade after its release in 2010, both of which are still relevant to the scene and well-regarded literary works, both of which happen to be eroge. If it is your first time hearing the word eroge, it is a portmanteau of the Japanese words ero, meaning erotic, and ge, meaning game. The trouble newcomers often have getting into visual novels is grappling with the meaning of this word, but the meaning of the word is quite simple in both the Japanese community and the English-speaking community. Any work with any erotic content at all is an eroge. Now, this is not a vague definition, but it does cast quite a large net. As one fan I asked summarized, in Japan, eroge is a pretty catch-all term. Whether it's 1% of the text or 99% of the text, the term just signifies that this sort of writing exists at all, without really making much of a judgment on the rest of the game, nor its placement in it. It's likely the misnomer started here. People who were not familiar with the nuance of the term eroge, meaning the work contained some erotic content of some sort, had ascribed a different meaning to the word and a different understanding of that visual novel. While I was working on the script, I bounced off some ideas on the community about the subject, and one person commented that the few erotic scenes in Fate's Stay Night, a drop in the bucket for a 150-hour plus game, felt forced and it didn't service the plot particularly well. There is some truth in this, and this leads to another source of possible confusion on this subject for newcomers, which I would take this opportunity to broach. In a trend that I feel began somewhere in the 2000s, although took off in the 2010s with the advent of digital downloads, visual novel developers began an effort to boost sales by appealing to wider audiences, and began segmenting out the erotic scenes of their works for special all-ages releases. Almost paradoxically, some developers also found the opposite to be true, and began inserting more erotic scenes for the same effect. In either case, because the writing had to be worked to allow easy transition to the primary story elements, and the story had to be worded in a way that certain scenes could be easily removed, it left both the games they produced and the medium as a whole in an awkward position. Whereas previously they had played straight to the middle and thus hit neither extreme, the industry also began struggling to straddle themselves between trying to appeal to the mainstream consumers while not abandoning their original mature audiences. Originally, the forgiveness of visual novel fans to allow artists to express themselves freely and with whatever tools they want to express themselves with also allowed some companies to invent awkward in-betweens to cater to fans of more sexual content. It is the irony that the free-going nature of most visual novel fans almost invited this sort of attitude. Most developers nowadays have settled on simply including character development relevant but not plot important erotic scenes as a toggleable feature, usually in the forms of age patches, so that they can hit both audiences at a compromise. This can be a detraction for sure, as any scene included not for the sake of the artistic pursuit but financial considerations is understandable, but does still forsake at least the artistic value of the scenes they appear in. I agree with this. However, many visual novels take this opportunity to tell stories that can only be told with H scenes as they were before. Katawa Shoujo, for example, has an H scene involving the character Hanako that, if removed, would literally change the entire meaning of numerous plot points and would wildly distort her personality. It could be contested how necessary certain scenes of Fate's Stay Night were to its overall story, but at the very least, one cannot write it off just for being a visual novel, since we already know that many of them use their unique opportunity in a medium that is accepting of sexual content to tell stories in ways that normally couldn't be told without those scenes. The truth is that most visual novel fans actually do care about whether or not erotic content is artistic or not. This is true, and it's even in the words we use to describe them. What some may not know is we actually have another word for games that do just happen to contain H scenes, but also for those that actually pursue them. When most people think H games as visual novels, they usually are thinking of instead what we call nukige. We separate these for a reason, because not everyone who reads visual novels are interested in the more serious ones that do not actively pursue sexual content in their work, and not everyone who reads visual novels are interested in sexual ones, which forego story and basically are H games. While Fate's Stay Night is an eroge by technicality, containing less than 1% of erotic content in the text, it is not a nukige, meaning it is not the majority of the work and does not pursue it either. I think it is this inability to differentiate that causes so much friction between the two communities. It is that people keep propagating the idiocy that, did you know Fate's Stay Night is a hentai? That visual novels get a bad reputation. There are now droves of people who will compare the greatest of classical works and high production value visual novels to these cheap acid flip $5 Chinese cheap knockoff hentai games on Steam, and everyone will believe they're the same thing. Looking at you, Sekai Project. And as one r/visual novels user put it, unfortunately that happens because people see the comments of these idiots ranting online about something they know literally nothing about with hundreds of upvotes from other idiots who think the same thing, and it's absolutely infuriating. Indeed, I believe so too, especially considering not only are visual novels not all nukige, many of them aren't even eroge to begin with. Remember those 7 visual novels I mentioned at the beginning? 4 of them were not eroge. Yes, not all visual novels are eroge, and the most popular ones in fact tend not to be. It seems to save Fate Stay Night from the mainstream falsehoods that keep following it everywhere, we need to start not with eroge, but even with the idea that just because a game is a visual novel does not mean it contains any sexual content in the first place. If you're watching this and new to the medium, this isn't an elitist backlash by veterans or anything. I wouldn't even consider myself a veteran of visual novels, as my VNDB page would communicate. I have barely exceeded even 20 visual novels read. This comes from heart to heart as someone exploring the medium fresh as anyone else. Please do not let yourself be deterred by what other people say. There are plenty of fantastic visual novels out there, and while plenty of them don't, some of them may contain sexual content. I don't judge. But please don't write off visual novels based on something as silly and immature as whether or not the artist chose to express themselves with bodily organs we all have and know. As for fans of Fate Stay Night, make sure people know that Fate Stay Night is not a nukige. Clear the misconception and introduce people to one of the greatest visual novels, and in my opinion, literary works, period, of all time. I don't want to stand idle while people ignore the beautiful art in front of them due to ignorance, especially if I know the truth. Please help me, help them, and I'll help you. Thank you for listening.